Tender Strands by Martin Dempsey. Chapter 1. Bridge. Many words have been, and will be, used to describe Arthur Cavell. Arthur Cavell is a dreamer. He is also the owner of a taxi-cab garage. He allows his taxi drivers to use his vehicles upon provision of a clean license, a background check, and an area knowledge exam. Where the drivers can't provide an official qualification, he's been known to simply ask them to drive him around for a while, even allowing them to use apps and satellite navigation. In the past, Cavell has helped out struggling individuals such as recent migrants, college dropouts, single mothers, by effectively loaning them the money to jump through these hoops and even let them off the first month's cab rental to help them get started, although Cavell keeps this quiet so not to be taken advantage of. Cavell encourages his drivers to join local unions and is fully compliant with the local employment laws and health and safety guidelines. Cavell also allows all his drivers to keep their own tips. As a result, if the truth, or some version of it, finally comes out, many of his drivers would be shocked and convinced there's been some misunderstanding, that he's been the victim of some terrible manipulation, a frame job, or some combination of factors. No one could be as fundamentally harmless, easygoing, insular, and such a big hippie as Arthur Cavell. Cavell is the first and only son to a mother whose parents hailed from Asia, and she, for a while, was something of an overbearing influence in his life. She emphasized the importance of math and IT, things which he didn't particularly enjoy, but which were topics he had come to do comparatively well for someone as a result of near daily private one-to-one tuition. Growing up, the idea of virtual realities, multiverses, and subjects like topography, graph theory, knot theory, hypergeometry, and string theory managed to hold his attention through his own constant attempts to relate them to the science fiction which was his true passion. However, as is often the case, his interest in specific subject areas in a field as wide and as deep as mathematics wasn't enough to transfer over to others nor to science as a whole. Cavell was accepted to study mathematics at a mid-tier university to the delight of his mother, but flagging grades and a newfound set of hobbies led to his having to choose between repeating his second year and dropping out. The recipient of a modest trust fund from a distant relative, an uncle in South Korea who made a small fortune on the stock market, and as one of several recipients of a small, regular collection of residuals from a fairly popular intellectual property, Cavell decided to drop out of higher education. Despite his parents' misgivings, Cavell decided to spend a year or so, the or so turned into his life up to this point, living on his own in a small apartment. According to whomever he was talking to at the time, he was planning a novel, working on a synthetic music album, attempting to build up his online streaming following, and in reality, Cavell was indulging his newfound interest in psychedelics. At the height of his usage, Cavell has even started growing trays of mushrooms in his apartment and had several marijuana plants under high UV lamps. Had Cavell not also been deeply interested in the works and ideas of Terence McKenna, Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, and Alan Watts, he might have moved into harder, more addictive and habit-forming drugs, rather than into guided dreaming and transcendental meditation. Far more interested in journaling the nature of his visions, hallucinations, sensations, and vivid dreams, the days, weeks, months, and eventually years began to slip by. Cavell, at first deeply disinterested and dismissive of such matters, finally began to notice that life was no longer keeping pace with him, that he had begun to start passing him by. The first few friends from university he kept in contact with and swapped tripping stories with graduated, and then got jobs, and then got married. Cavell found himself in his early 30s and unfashionably stuck in his ways, his tie-dyed yoga pants now looking out of place rather than trendy. He was too fortunate to be considered disenfranchised, or to fit in with the new political trends of collectivism and identity politics, which replaced those of the individualism of grunge and punk revival and techno DJs he had cut his teeth on. More troubling by far, scratching and living as he was off dividends and making up for the shortfall by regularly dipping into his shrinking by the quartile inheritance had left him too near to subsistence to be considered financially stable. In truth, he realized if he didn't turn things around in the next few years, he'd find himself in a bad spot with few opportunities open to him. There were four main things that he did have going for him. Firstly, he had the ability to liquidate the remains of his inheritance and pool it with the regular IP residuals installments to create a sizable down payment on a small business, in the event he managed to buy it outright. Secondly, he'd elected to take extra credits in engine maintenance in his first year at university and liked cars. Thirdly, the work he had actually done at university had left him a dab hand at spreadsheets and basic finance. Fourthly, and most importantly, he was smart enough to realize when the regular income and slowly reducing bulk sum of money he had, the indulgence of his parents, and society's systemic apathy towards individuals who aren't actively harming others was, in fact, no longer helping him. In truth, all of these advantages were simply protecting him from the immediate ramifications of his own bad decisions. After pulling an all-nighter listening to Alan Watts' lecture on the importance of interconnectivity and personal responsibility, he decided to sink the majority of his liquidated shares into a business that he would either have to run correctly or else start over again, once more trapped into relying on residuals to make do. Now, predictable overheads and the fact that even a low level of trade would be more than enough to cover his own personal living costs, because it turns out a single male who lives off a subsistence vegan diet is totally disinterested in fashion, pop culture, and socializing, and his main hobbies are yoga, jogging, and sleeping at least 10 hours in every 24, has low overheads. And the whole thing can be managed on 4 spreadsheets with minimal human interaction. Well, this led Cavell to become the fell-into owner of Cavell Taxi Management Incorporated. In all honesty, the previous owner left the business before her own early retirement in such good order that it practically ran itself, and the small back office became more a second location for Cavell to meditate than a place of work. The cab firm became the central routine provider for Cavell's life over nearly the next decade, which flew by. In his downtime, he had a handful of one-night stands, one of which could almost be called an affair, had Cavell put in any effort at all, including returning her calls. He travelled a bit in the waking world, and overall lived fairly comfortably by his own standards. Cavell knew he wasn't exactly an amazing catch, despite his effortless piratical good looks and slender rangy flame. He used that as an excuse to get even more set in his ways. Cavell became a man who not only had a set bedtime, but who knew which pair of socks he'd be wearing each day of the week, and in weeks of the year which he'd need to do a double shop to account for the stores closing early for a public holiday. Cavell wasn't bored or unfulfilled, however. In his mind, he'd made a success of himself and was a respectable member of the community. And, in all fairness, in his way, he was. His employers and subcontractors didn't exactly mind him, if not exactly respected him, and his, up until recently, relaxed and unaffected bohemian outlook on life made him a net positive gain to the world. Those people he'd quietly helped into getting started as a cab driver by perhaps turning a blind eye to an absence of a passport, or by silently paying for their cab license, or by providing glowing recommendations for CVs, they would defend him as a good man for the rest of their lives. Over the years, Cavell had developed quite an extensive consumer reputation on the dark web. His knowledge of IT aided him in using the dark web relatively safely to procure his hallucinogens, and his extensive list of reviews and customer feedback even netted him the occasional free sample. One such free sample, Lao seeds, which arrived in his apartment in a padded manila envelope with a vacuum-sealed Malo bag inside, contained one of the few drugs Cavell had heard about, but never tried. Although not strictly illegal, in the same way that spice wasn't, it was still hard to track down unless you had an in. Very fond of DMT, Cavell's thrice yearly holidays from running the taxi cab company were usually several day and night long DMT trips, and had been for years at this point. He was excited to try Lao. He remembered his grandfather was raving about it. and smoked a good-sized chunk of it as soon as he had enough, which took a remarkably short space of time. For his first taste, he settled down with Brian Eno playing in the background, and heated up his plus-sized lava lamp. He felt the effects almost immediately. It was a harsh smoke, harsher than DMT even, but his mind immediately started to make the soft, quiet, nonsensical connections and extrapolations of near sleep. Pulling on his largest pair of novelty slippers and faux fur-lined hooded dressing gown, he turned on his 10-hour MP3 C-Waves file and lay back in his extra-large beanbag. As the soft balls crowded around the base of his neck, he let his eyes close and immediately envisioned himself standing up again and retracing his steps outside of his apartment. As he did so, he felt the line between his memory and his imagination blur, and a sense of clarity overcame his senses. The floor under his imagined feet felt as it should. He ran his fingers along the wall as he made his way, still in his mind's eye, outside, and felt gravel scuff under the rubber soles of his shoes. An avid and experienced lucid dreamer, Cavell had rarely experienced such intense and material dreams. Cavell walked on, exploring the city in his dream, cognizant of the nonsensical and incongruent changes that came with a vivid dreaming experience, such as the dogs walking each other in pairs, or the newspapers flapping past like birds. When, as the very last of the Lao drug was inhaled, and the tiny hand-carved ivory pipe lowered and rested against his sleeping lower lip, Cavell found himself at the open and unguarded entrance to the tallest skyscraper in his city. Excited, Cavell entered the tiled atrium, still marveling at the depth and the clarity of the sensory feedback of his dream. He had no way of telling if this aspect was a genuine memory or a fabrication. It's useful to keep track in one's vivid dreaming to be able to guide the events. But he knew he'd never entered this building before. On a whim, he decided to run up the stairs, finding himself on the roof terrace in a moment. The city unfolded around him, and he felt the firm lick of the wind against his cheeks. The stone spiral staircase, which corkscrewed up into the clouds in front of him, took him by surprise. And after all, how could he resist? This climb didn't pass in moments, and as his feet softly met the grooved indentations in each step, which the waking world would have taken 1,000 years to form, he decided there must have been a light source to light his way. And the thought echoed in his mind a few times before he came across a flaming torch resting in a divot of the tower's wall. Cavell climbed and climbed, sometimes 2 steps at a time, a distance he guessed must have been at least equal to that of the skyscraper. The radiating light of the torch had pre-adapted his eyes for the sunlight, which suddenly engulfed him as he stepped out to the staircase onto the white sand, turning his head to drink in his new surroundings, staring at his feet, taking in the snow-white beach, the opening of the sheer stone behind him from which he'd exited the staircase, which constituted but one of the many caves and openings in the cliff face. Cavell took a deep breath of sea air, the first he'd tasted in decades. The first visit, Cavell did little else but walk up and down the beach. He gazed out into the horizon, toyed with driftwood, touched the water to his lips. This was the most beautiful place he'd ever been, even in his dreams. The next night, Cavell returned, grateful the Lao had such a soporific effect, as the anticipation of returning caused him to feel his heart beat. The second time he felt the stone steps under his feet as soon as he closed his eyes, and only a few strides later the white sand yielded beneath his toes. This visit he explored further. He turned over some perfectly round, disc-shaped stones and attempted to make sense of the engravings of the frog-fish man-like things. Off against the horizon at one point, he made out the white sails of a galleon. As he looked on, one of the fluffy, low-flying clouds drifted against the breeze near it, unfurled tentacles of mist, opened a large, central white fluffy eye, and dragged it over the edge of the horizon and out of the limits of his squinting vision. Each night thereafter Cavil returned, his supply of Lao never at risk of running out due to its amazing growth rate. He ordered new UV lights to speed its growth, and even attempted to buy more seeds from the seller's account, which he found had shut down. He found he could now return to the beach as soon as he fell asleep, and could remember his visits just as clearly upon waking, as if the Lao had awakened the dreamer within him he had attempted to rouse for years. Cavil even considered starting a sideline in selling the quasi-legal herb, and set up a few UV lamps and seeded pots in a barely used cellar under the cab firm. Each night he swam in the cool, clear tides, crafted sand sculptures which far surpassed any he'd ever made awake, skipped stones, exalted the peach and gold sunsets. Here, in this place, Cavil learned what it was to be happy. Soon his interest turned to one of the many cracks in the cliff face. It led down into the dark. Fearing little by this point, they were his dreams after all, and Cavil had become quite adept at altering their course at will. Cavil climbed in. When the rubble beneath his feet gave way, Cavil wasn't afraid, and enjoyed the scudding, scrabbling slide. When he entered space for a short while, Cavil wasn't afraid. He'd flown in his dreams before. When he landed in soft, impossibly long silken strands, Cavil wasn't afraid. They were cool, a silvery grey of slate and pearl, and smooth and intricate. Beautiful. Cavil could make out the verge of a chasm whose further shore was lost in darkness, lit only by the shards of sunlight that must have been stories above him, and pools of luminescent fungi and lichen. The silky, twanging, bungee-like chords spanned the gulf. Despite being unable to turn his head all the way, Cavil felt as if there were a bottom to the pit capable to be made out he'd be able to. Yet Cavil wasn't afraid. The ties which bind are also the strands which support, and as Cavil bounced in the net-like mesh, he began to wonder if he'd climb out, simply stay there until he awoke, or attempt to fly. There was no reason to be afraid. When he saw the many swift and delicate, almost tentative, jointed legs, the train carriage-sized round thorax, the near human-shaped face, and the perfectly round, black, staring eyes surrounded with wispy white hair. That was when Cavil was afraid. A nasal piping scraped the nerves of his teeth, wrenching the hair on the back of his neck on end. The shrill whines coalesced, and Cavil, even through the desperate, tugging desire to curl into a ball, made out the words, "I can't eat you." The face loomed closer. It had a polished quality, somewhere between porcelain, bone, and chicken. Accompanying the shrill whistle, there was a bass line of Shirilla, clacking against human-like incisors. "I already have a horse in storage, and I've yet to repair the damage it caused. I don't have time." The black discs drew close to Cavil's own eyes, and he could make out several warped reflections of his blanched face straining to turn as far away as possible, each from a slightly different angle. "Recompense must be made, of course, but your wait has served to test the strength of this part of the bridge." The head tilted, then swung up and down as if surveying and taking the whole of Cavill's body, then returned and tilted to the side as if calculating. A flock of wispy white hair fell from the ruff of its neck and over the top half of its head, obscuring several of the eyes. A leg flicked up and brushed it aside. "You're young and strong for your kind, yes?" Cavill's back muscles strained as he attempted to horseshoe himself away from the thing. "I will need to devote some time to watch hatching soon. Maybe that's how you could come and smite me for the damage." Two fangs as black as the thing's eyes and the length of Cavill's face were revealed as the Shrillet shuffled. "Very well. Go then with this gash I impose upon you." Cavill attempted to make his mouth form words. Maybe it was wait, or please, or perhaps an attempt to question. The thing moved its face millimeters from Cavill's, and for a single moment the reflection of Cavill's eyes appeared in perfect alignment with the two largest forward-facing discs, and Cavill saw the raw terror reflected within them. Then, with a hiss of the thing's fangs opened, jutted out like cleats, and then dug into his upper right arm. A primordial, cloying, deep nerve pain consumed Cavill, and he screamed so hard the pain of that act of vocal exertion felt as if the thing had a second set of fangs raking open his throat.